What defines a political or social bubble? What brings one into existence in the first place? What allows it to grow, to fester, and even to eventually renew? Across history and across every corner of the globe, we've seen bubbles form around society after society. Some are made up of hate, while some insulate other forms of stupidity inherent to whatever wrong-headed ideology they find their roots in. Some even find their origins in good, seeking to shelter its inhabitants from a perceived force of wrong. All are born of a similar gene, however, fear. Fear of the other, fear of failure, and often sustained by the fear of having been wrong all along. Equally inevitable is their result, violence and pain, a uniform eventuality of being told the only correct path is to remain enclosed in fear. I wanted to examine this unfortunate aspect of our shared culture of humanity through the prism of art, in specific, film. Because it's through artistic expression that we most often find the truths of the past, revealing the pain that in turn brought about more of itself. It would take 2 lifetimes to attempt to find some explanation for every example of a bubble from the 200,000 odd years that we've been around, so I decided to focus on 3 specific eras: the Cold War and the fall of the USSR, the Second World War from the German perspective, and the financial crisis of 07 and 08 in the US, and the depiction in film, using 5 works as reference points for each period. Let's begin with the financial crisis. 3 of the films I selected analyze that turbulent time from the perspective of those directly involved in the machine that allowed the economy to come to the years-long halt that it did. Curtis Hansen's Too Big to Fail, Adam McKay's The Big Short, and J.C. Chandler's Margin Call. While the first 2 dedicate much of their runtime to the specifics of the event and come from a clear, entirely unsubtle place of anger, one of The Big Short's leads, Mark Baum, quite literally shouts, "There's a bubble," over the phone at one point in the film. It's the latter that I want to zero in on, specifically one of its final scenes. Chandler's film analyzes the night that a fictional firm realizes that it, as well as the market itself, is going to come crashing down, eventually building to a widespread asset sale that will, as known by every single person involved in its making, signal the beginning of the death of the modern American dream, and lose millions of people, these men and women never met, their jobs and hard-earned money. The thread culminates in one of the film's lead protagonists, a cynical chief broker portrayed by Kevin Spacey. Yes, it is awkward, sitting down for a chat with the head of the firm, John Told, played by Jeremy Irons in the film. Over the course of the conversation, Spacey's character expresses his grievances with what the company has done, seemingly confirming he intends to leave it and its ideology behind. Told then counters with a monologue that perfectly encapsulates the bubble of nihilistic capitalism that led to the market crash, saying, quote, "Told us the same thing over and over. We can't help ourselves, and you and I can't control it, or stop it, or even slow it, or even ever so slightly alter it. We just react. We make a lot of money if we get it right, and we get left by the side of the road if we get it wrong." On the complete flip side, there are the other 2 films I chose, Hell or High Water and 99 Homes, from David Mackenzie and Ramin Barani, respectively. These films address the cost of men like John Told's philosophy on the average American, both highlighting the painful, illegal, and violent in the case of the former, cycle millions were forced into by a system that post-08 no longer even hides the fact that it doesn't care about these people, all while telling them to believe in the bubble, to believe that the dream is still achievable, to fear what would happen if they finally stopped believing. When it comes to the USSR and the Cold War, the bubble is vastly more obvious on both sides of the conflict. 2 powers obsessed with both their own ideologies as well as their mutual hatred and fear of the other. As underlined by 2 of the films I selected, Spielberg's Bridge of Spies and Marvin Reed's The Spy Came In From the Cold, the pain of this era was unimaginable, both films telling the stories of men who were forced to work between each bubble, ultimately realizing the cost they had on the people living under them, as well as on worldwide morality. Similarly, The Lives of Others, directed by Florian von Danneschmach, a West German clearly obsessed with the horror that occurred just across from him in his teenage years, is about a government agent who ultimately utilizes the gears behind the East German Soviet bubble for good, saving the life of a man who, by addressing and criticizing the very existence of the bubble and daring to not fear it, is deemed a threat to the ideology's survival. The 4th, and in my opinion most tragic film I analyzed, is also ironically a comedy. Directed by Wolfgang Becker, Goodbye Lenin is a film about Alex, an East German man who, in order to keep his mother around for as long as he possibly can, must hide the fact that the USSR, and therefore the world she had known all her life, is kaput. In other words, Alex is forced out of love for his mother and the fear of losing her to create a bubble around the pre-existing and now expired one she had always lived under, thereby never allowing her to know that she had ultimately outlived that reign of tyranny and falsehoods. The final film in this section is also the most recent, Armando Iannucci's 2018 satire, The Death of Stalin. While it's most certainly a farce with wildly varying accent work and a near constant stream of jokes, the film remains wonderfully insightful about the roots of the Soviet ideology, underlining the dissolution of said roots when it became clear that the Lenin-era messaging about uniform equality had brought about a crisis of greedy and violent machinations no better than those on the side of the capitalists they so often decry. The final historical period I decided to take a look at through the eyes of my thesis was World War II era Germany. Easily the most blatantly haunting of these three times, it was a decade-long period of open hatred and propaganda that ultimately resulted in a time of extreme realization and guilt. The latter of those two results following the war is perfectly highlighted in Martin Zandvoligt's 2015 post-war thriller Land of Mine, a gloriously unsettled film about a group of Denmark-stationed German soldiers forced to, in literal fashion, dig up the minefield of their complicated and now sullied pasts. A second of the film that took a look at it from this era, The Bridge, is also told from the perspective of young German soldiers. Directed by Austrian filmmaker Bernard Wicki, a political activist who was imprisoned in a concentration camp for several years, the deeply anti-war picture finds its power in its analysis of the dangerous combination of youthful naivete and war, following a group of Hitler youth turned fighters that decided to defend their beloved fatherland and its Fuhrer by fighting for a German-held bridge from Allied forces, despite the warnings of their older, wizened comrades. In the end, only one of the boys walks away with his life after he is dismissed and ridiculed by engineer officers who show up all too late to demolish the bridge. Similarly, taking a look at the forceful destruction of belief in the righteousness of the war and the ideology behind it, Oliver Hirschspiegel's Oscar-winning 2004 film Downfall observes the final days and weeks of Hitler's life in his Berlin bunker through the eyes of his secretary, Charlotte Junge. Over the course of the film, the bubble of German Nazism is slowly popped for Junge as she realizes the pathetic, defeated man behind the fear-based ideology and all its glorified, now iconic propaganda. The final film I want to talk about is also the oldest, Roberto Rossellini's Germany Year Zero, the closing entry in the Italian director's iconic war trilogy. Clearly haunted by the appalling crimes committed by a government ally with his own during the war, Rossellini simultaneously analyzes both the guilt and the residual hatred present in Germany immediately following the fall of the Third Reich, and the revealing of just exactly what Hitler and Adolf Eichmann's final solution was. The revered filmmaker does this from the perspective of a young boy who cannot comprehend the context of the broken and divided Berlin he finds himself in. That confusion leads to the boy, influenced by his Nazi-sympathizing schoolteacher's belief that the sick man of Germany must be forced to make way for the strong, murdering his bedridden father and subsequently killing himself when his action does not warrant him the love and adoration he so clearly longs for. The point that Rossellini, similarly to Wicki's contemporary, makes with this once-hated film is that the bubble of German Nazism ultimately affects to an inherently tragic degree those whose innocence makes them blissfully unaware of its own existence. What are we to take from these films? Even more importantly, what are we to take from the lessons of the eras they depict? An optimistic perspective would tell you that we are merely to see them as profiles of the past, as stories of dark periods in humanity's history that are now behind us, as examples of bubbles unlike any we were ever to see again. But what does that perspective have to say for Heather Heyer in Charlottesville, for the men and women and children being deprived of basic rights and often murdered by religion-based terror groups in nations across the Middle East, Europe, and Africa? If political and social bubbles are an inherent characteristic of the human experience, then the violence that results from them is just as inevitable.